8-bit, the era where console games finally started to be as good as arcade games. Also the era where they were fucking crazy hard. The 8-bit era was a fascinating era because it was game developers' first real attempts to make home gaming experiences that could stand independently from arcade counterparts. This was that brief moment in history where the absurd difficulty of arcade games was also a prominent feature of console games. And several NES games in particular have gone down in infamy as some of the hardest games of all time. I may not be one of the biggest experts of these games, but I am certainly one of the biggest fans. Personally, I call them the 8-bit bastards. I grew up with some of the 8-bit bastards. Some of my earliest game experiences, before I even knew what game difficulty was, were with these games. If I have one skill, it's overanalyzing things. So I thought I'd make a little love letter to my all-time favorite genre. I'm not much of an emulator person, so I can only really review the games that I happen to own, but I do think the games I own portray a clear enough picture of what this era was like. Warning you now, though, that this is going to be a very long and detailed look into a very niche kind of gaming experience. I'll put timecodes so you can skip to any particular game you want to hear about. So let's get on with it and review the 8-bit bastards. One of the things that really separates Castlevania from the rest of the bunch is that it's not a very busy game. You're not constantly bombarded with enemies. There's actually a bit of breathing room and space. No, what makes it hard isn't the world around Simon Belmont, but rather Simon himself. He's very slow. I think that has to do with the animation. He seems to have slightly more detailed walking animations and combat animations than other NES characters, and that makes the game much more aesthetically appealing, but the sacrifice is that he moves at a slower pace. But the game around him is just busy enough to be hard without feeling miserable. It feels more relaxed than Contra or Ninja Gaiden. But make no mistake about it, Castlevania is hard as fuck. In fact, this is one of the many NES games that I simply cannot beat. I always like to say that the two most important factors to how a game functions is the player's character and the world around that character. That is to say, game mechanics and level design. Not just how well these things work on their own, but also how well they function together. As I said, the animation is a large factor to Simon Belmont. He has a more detailed walk cycle, and the character himself has a lot more detail than a character like Mario. If he weren't so detailed, but still walked this slow, the game would be more frustrating than it is. But the animation goes a long way towards making the game enjoyable, even when it's difficult. It genuinely feels nice to walk around as Simon. Also, unlike that shitty Dragon's Lair NES game, Simon is also able to stop on a dime when you attack or let go of the D-pad. Rather than having momentum like Mario does, he just has a steady pace that has a small feel of momentum because of the animation. Specifically the fact that Simon bobs back and forth, making his body feel like one object, rather than a dislocated series of functional parts. Imagine if you took away his animation and he just slid around everywhere. The game would still be hard, but it wouldn't really be as fun anymore. What I'm saying is the graphics and animations go a long way towards aiding the game feel. Mechanically speaking, Simon is fairly simple. Like I said, he has no momentum. His movement is at a static pace at pretty much all times. Because he can stop the instant you stop moving, and because he has no acceleration, his ability to move is very directly tied to how you press buttons, meaning the game doesn't feel at all slippery, which again is aided by the animation and the walking speed. The movement is actually fairly precise in that regard, which makes it always feel fair. You're never screwed over by slippery controls. If you mess up, it's on you. In fact, when it comes to walk cycle alone, I'd say that Castlevania achieves perfection at what it's going for. As for jumping, it's hard to say that it's flawed necessarily, but the jumping mechanics are very unforgiving, I'll say that much. If you jump while standing still, you jump straight up. If you jump while moving, you continue moving at the same speed in that same direction until you land, meaning that jumps are not at all about mid-air movement, and are all about timing. If you jump at the wrong time, you could be dead, with absolutely zero chance to correct your jump before landing. This means you have to dedicate yourself to every jump you make, which is fine, that just comes with the game. I can't complain about that because it adds to the challenge, and the challenge is why I play games like this in the first place. But a newcomer, coming over from a game like Mario, will be terribly frustrated with the unforgiving jumping mechanic, and I have to keep outside perspectives in mind with something like this. Really though, there is a compromise that could have been done. There could have been a way to give the player some more freedom with jumping, which could be worked around with new challenges that are based around a more forgiving jumping mechanic. What I'm saying isn't that the jumping as it is now is bad, I'm just saying it can cause situations of what many people would consider unfair deaths. Would I prefer it with more forgiving jumping? Personally, I don't think I would, because working around a more forgiving jumping mechanic would also mean changing the level design to be more fluid and less blocky. The blocky level design would be too easy to navigate with easier jumping mechanics, and changing the level design would hamper the experience. We'll get there later though. Another important thing to note, one of the major contributors to unfair deaths is falling. Castlevania has the classic 8-bit bastard symptom of falling back when you get hit. Falling in this game is almost brick-like when you don't jump first, meaning any hole in the ground that you don't carefully jump over will be instant death without any chance of saving yourself. When you get hit on the ground, you just take a hit. But when you get hit in the air, it knocks you back, and I'm pretty sure it always knocks you away from the direction that the enemy was in relation to you. This means if you're near a pitfall and an enemy, chances are you're toast. What makes this mechanic especially egregious in this game is just how far back you get knocked. It seems to be just about the same length as a normal jump, but in reverse. Of course, this mechanic can be exploited for speedrunning purposes, which is a little fun. You would think that near pitfalls is where it becomes most painful, but I'd argue the most painful parts are when you're around a lot of enemies, because it means that you'll end up taking damage repeatedly and being incapable of progressing. Sometimes I'll get passed back and forth like a goddamn volleyball, and those are probably the most painful moments of the game for me. But I'm not someone who wants to dislike games, so I do offer a degree of forgiveness for difficult controls. The fallback may be obnoxious, and distancing my own opinion for a second, the fallback may be generally perceived as a flaw, but I don't think I'd have it any other way because it is a challenge. And again, that's what I play the game for. Combat-wise, there are only two ways of fighting enemies. You either hit them with your whip, or you hit them with your secondary weapon. The whip is a lot of fun. It conveniently fits with the horror genre quite well because I always remember slasher villains having an iconic weapon of some kind. Leatherface always used his chainsaw, Freddy had his gloves, Michael Myers had his kitchen knife, and Jason sucked. Hell, even Jack Torrance had his trademark axe, and The Shining barely even qualifies as a slasher film. Giving Simon Belmont a unique weapon among other 8-bit games I think went a long way towards making the combat with the whip more memorable. When you really think about it, it's just a melee weapon with slightly longer range than something like the sword in Ninja Gaiden, but it still has that undefinable cool factor. The whip of course has 3 stages, and there's absolutely no reason to not get it to the 3rd stage, because it's more powerful and has longer range. Really, the earlier stages are just a way to punish players temporarily for dying. One thing that's interesting about having a mid-range melee weapon is that it encourages the player to slow down, take time, and keep distance. Rather than a game like Mario where the melee rewards precision and speed, Castlevania rewards patience and pattern memorization. Thanks to the difficulty of these games, pretty much all of the 8-bit bastards have that theme running through them. But I think it's especially present in Castlevania because of the fact that Simon moves much slower than other characters. The whip also has a slow animation, much like Simon's walking, which means that rather than an instant hit, there's a delay of what appears to be about 5 frames. The whip also appears to be extended and in damage mode for about 4 frames or so, meaning that it takes 9 or 10 frames or so before you can strike again. I could be wrong, but I think that means that overall you can only attack about 2 times per second, which is interesting because other enemies can attack more than 2 times per second, meaning that this low enemy count is made up for by the difficulty that projectile enemies present, which is how Castlevania gives off the illusion of being a relaxing game. For me, it actually is relaxing, because challenging games relax me for some reason, and it is relaxing relative to other games in this video, but the difficulty is in the slow movement and combat against things that can hit more and move faster. The secondary weapons are a variety, but they almost always work in tandem with the whip. Mechanically, they're not that interesting, so I don't really feel the need to go into them, but I'll just say that my least favorite is the knife, and my favorite is the cross boomerang. Once you cover Simon himself, the world around him is actually not all that interesting. I mean, obviously it's visually pretty interesting and the music fucking rules, but the level design is fairly basic. It's worth noting that, as far as I remember, there is no vertical scrolling in the game. That means each room is reduced to a hallway of the same height, and considering that the game is constructed around block textures for the most part, the game has a very rectangular feel to it, which has its pros and cons. One of the major benefits to rectangular design is that it's flat, and it allows a consistent perspective that never fails the player. You know whether or not you're going to land on a space because it will be flatly underneath you. None of those bullshit angled platforms where the forced perspective means that you can fall through the platform somehow. Everything is clear cut. You know what you can stand on, you know where to land, things are clear. As for cons, it makes the game really samey, and also makes for weaker level design. You go right, you climb up some stairs, you climb down some stairs, you go left, rinse and repeat forever. There's none of those Mario 3 moments where the game can throw a level design curveball at you. It just sticks rigidly to a formula. A successful formula, but a less dynamic formula. However, there's one personal little benefit to the rectangular design for me, and that's the fact that I've attempted to program games in the past. Without a doubt, I'm no good at it, but I am aware of how to make a basic block platformer. I've done it before. Like I said, mine were terrible. But when I see a professional real game on a real console, and I can see those seams and know how they made it, it inspires me a lot. It reminds me that I could make a game too, if I could just figure out graphic design and knew how to program beyond little kiddie programs. Really though, the major difficulty of the game is the enemies, specifically their patterns and placement. The game seems to really want you dead at all costs, so they designed the enemies to be obnoxiously hard to kill. First, you got my favorite enemy in every game, Mr. Bones, who jumps around like a maniac and can hop back and forth between platforms. While in earlier levels he's not too bad, around the time of level 5 he becomes an asshole of a hassle. Then there's this little fucker, and I can't tell if it's Igor or a monkey or a hunchback or what, but it's certainly a nightmare to handle. The reason why it's difficult is because its pattern is seemingly random, but it actually isn't. What it does is it hops towards you, and when it gets close enough to you, it tries to jump over you. Granted, you'll be moving around, it'll probably either hit you before it jumps over, or you'll back up and it'll hit you when it jumps over. So the real strategy is to wait for it to get close and try jumping over you, then move forward and strike it from behind. Or alternatively, with the long whip, you can wait for it to get close and before it jumps over you hit it then. Either way, this process is complicated by the fact that there's usually multiple enemies including multiple Igors in a space at the same time. Then there's the Medusa heads, which everyone seems to hate more than I do. Sure, the Medusa heads can be annoying at times, but I'm not too bothered by them because their pattern is very basic. They just swerve up and down. They never change speed, direction, or anything. The only thing that changes is where they come from, and that's entirely dependent on how you move. They seem to have spawn points that are beyond the view on screen. This means that they spawn at exactly the same height relative to you, and going in the direction that is toward you. So if you back up, a Medusa head will come at you from the backwards direction, and as you move forward, a Medusa head will come at you from the forwards direction. This also means that if you hit their spawn point while jumping, the Medusa head will be slightly above the ground level that it's usually at. Once you get a feel for how these spawn points work, the Medusa heads aren't too much of a problem by themselves. They only become a real problem when you get to the hallway before the Grim Reaper, and even then there's a simple workaround. Just stay ducked and keep whipping, and then throw the cross between Medusas, being careful for the knight's axes. Of course, things don't always work out for the best, but this is a trial and error game. Speaking of the knights are possibly my favorite enemy in the game, mostly because they're pretty hilarious. I think the first time you encounter this particular kind of knight is in level 5, and the very first one makes me laugh every time I see him. Specifically because if you charge towards him, he'll eventually back up off screen and just disappear. It's almost like he's cowardly, like he was the first one on the front line, and he sees Simon and he's like, oh fuck, I'm not ready for this, I'm out, see ya! The knights in general aren't too painful, but the biggest pain about them is that they back up whenever you try to get closer to them, meaning that you're constantly chasing after them because they're apparently just big babies who are afraid to take you on. When you stack up the enemies individually, they are a minor pain, but when you see how they're arranged in the game, they quickly turn into a major pain. It becomes a big juggling act of memorizing the patterns. You have to memorize the individual patterns of enemies, and then you have to be able to deal with multiple patterns simultaneously, and that's the real trick. Which combined with the slow mechanics means that you either have to be very patient or very precise. And what else could describe an 8-bit bastard better? I won't get too much into the bosses, but generally speaking the bosses all have some sort of cheap workaround that I usually exploit because they can and it's not cheating. If the game considers it fair to bombard me with difficult patterns, then I consider it fair to play cheap with the boss battles. As far as I can tell, the cheap workarounds don't apply after the 4th boss, with the 5th boss, the Grim Reaper, requiring pure skill to pass. Unfortunately for me, I haven't beaten the Grim Reaper yet, meaning I haven't even beaten Castlevania, but I will someday. So what makes this game hard? Well, simply put, it's the way in which Simon controls. He's very slow and takes up a lot of space. Some enemies that have attacks that can't be dodged, and so you have to have good timing with the whip, and some enemies have attacks that must be dodged, which means you have to be pretty handy with the slow controls. I wouldn't find the game too hard if not for moments like the Grim Reaper where being quick on your feet is important, but also hampered by the slow-paced controls. But what makes this game worth playing? Well, part of it is the atmosphere. Sure, it's not a scary game by today's standards, but late at night, lights off, TV on, the game has that isolating atmosphere that's really impressive. The music is some of the best music in gaming history, and the game looks and runs fantastically. The challenge keeps you on for a long time, and it's definitely worth playing for fans of 8-bit platformers and gothic horror. It also has a more relaxed pace to it that makes it stand out from other 8-bit bastards, so it's worth playing if you want a challenge that isn't based around speed. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is bad. Honestly, it's just not a very fun game to play. To be fair, it is fun for the first 20 minutes, but after that it gets really dull really fast. Part of the problem is that it feels like the creators had no idea what they were doing, so it's just this weak mashup of beat-em-up, platformer, and a top-down game of some kind. I don't know. The problem is, these elements on their own aren't inherently good. It's how you execute them that matters. And TMNT hypothetically has everything a good game needs, except it doesn't do those things correctly in order to make it a good game. I'll be fair and say that I didn't play very far into the game, so I'm basing the criticisms of the game around the core mechanics and early level design, rather than the game as a whole. So why doesn't it work? Well, first of all, the turtles control pretty poorly. The game bears some small resemblance to Castlevania, most specifically with regard to level layout and character size. Mario, when he's small, takes up only one block of space, meaning he can fit into some pretty small spaces and levels can be designed with this ability in mind. Simon Belmont, by contrast, takes up a larger portion of the screen, and the levels are designed around that. The major problems with TMNT are that the turtles are too big, the level design is too claustrophobic, the jump is too floaty, and the invulnerability between getting hit is too short. The turtles all have the size of a character like Simon Belmont, but Simon's levels were designed with a taller pixel size in mind. It seems almost like the game was developed independently from the turtles, because the taller pixel size means that you get moments like the infamous pizza in a box that the angry video game nerd had difficulty with, and the even more infamous you can just walk over it section. If the turtles had been shrunken down a bit, or alternatively had the levels been less cramped, those sections wouldn't have been issues. Another simple solution would have been to just let the turtles jump through platforms to land on top. Then there's the floaty jumps, which are probably the most egregious issue about the game, because it means that you overshoot every jump you attempt, and so you gotta be pixel perfect with each one. And again, if the levels were more sprawled out, the floaty jumps wouldn't be as bad, but there's still just too high of jumps. It's okay to have a high jump, but even when your short jump is too high, that's when it becomes a real problem. But I think the thing that gets me the most is the invulnerability issue, because it means you can take hits at such rapid pace that you can be brought down to almost dead or even killed in seconds, because of no buffer between the hits. When people complain about knockback in games like Castlevania and Ninja Gaiden, I sometimes wonder if this is why. Getting knocked away means you don't get hit a second time in the same spot. Don't get me wrong, this game is definitely an 8-bit bastard, but it's an 8-bit bastard because the creators did a poor job of fine-tuning the game into something fun to play. And those issues don't just make the game hard to play, it also makes the game hard to design. Having such cramped level design means that you can't really do anything to differentiate the levels from each other, and it becomes the same walking through corridors full of generic enemies throughout the game. Ironically, my favorite section of the game is the water section, because at least it's something different. See, if you're going to focus on one set of core mechanics, then you need to master them so that using them through numerous levels is fun and never feels redundant. And you also need to do something to differentiate the levels. TMNT fails on both accounts, and so while it is hard, it never feels rewarding. I couldn't be fucked to make it past two main sections of the game, so as far as I can tell, the core gameplay is traveling through an overview kind of map area into various buildings and sewers that start platforming beat-em-up sections. I've already talked about the problems with the beat-em-up sections, but the map is also kind of a problem, because the game is actually kind of a non-linear experience, and I'm all for that in NES games. I used to be addicted to the original Zelda specifically because of the non-linearity of it, but here it's so out of place because it goes from exploratory to disorienting. Part of that is that I didn't bother to look at the map, but part of that is how samey the levels feel and how many paths lead to dead ends. Even if you do look at the map, it's hard to tell where you've been and where you need to go, and that's what ultimately made me give up on the game. Not that it was too hard, but that I was feeling myself drifting off into other things in my mind, because the game makes no attempt to really guide you towards something rewarding. You just meander around looking for where to go next, and that's just not something that fits well with a game that's really difficult. Exploration should be a bit more relaxed, and have at least some degree of guidance for the player. But TMNT just feels like a messy excuse for an exploration element to the game. The overhead sections are boring and pointless, so there's really no reason at all that the game couldn't have just been a completely linear experience. While I do like non-linearity, I don't think of it as automatically a good thing, and games should be suited to whatever makes the experience work best. The overall point here is that TMNT does not suit itself to what makes the experience work best. I don't think I should be all negative though, so I will say a few positive things. First of all, the 4 turtles concept is a good idea, even though it wasn't very well fleshed out. Leonardo uses his sword, which is kind of medium range, and so he's pretty useful. I usually use him the most because I want to save Donatello for backup and important parts, so Leo can take the hits while still having a decent weapon. Raphael is utterly useless, so there's not much to say there. Michelangelo is also somewhat medium range, and he also has the fastest attack, I think, so he's about as useful as Leonardo, and I use him if Leo dies in combat. Donatello, of course, is the best turtle of the bunch because he has the longest range, and I typically save him for boss battles and clearing out spaces that I can't afford to get too close to. I try to save him for last. Overall, though, I really do like the 4 turtles concept, especially because it means 4 health bars, and you can switch turtles whenever 1 health bar gets too low. I think the game could have benefited from tailoring the levels around that gimmick to some degree, though you could argue that the water level does that. They could have a tense moment where you're forced to go through a section with only 1 turtle, as a means of disempowering the player to change the pace of the game. There's lots of things they could have done with it, and I think the biggest missed opportunity is the weapons. All of their weapons are melee. It would have been more interesting if there were some projectile weapons or some different kinds of attacks for different characters. It would have been especially cool if they each had special attacks of some kind. These things would help the concept to be more useful in the final game, but as it stands now, it's still a pretty novel concept. Like I said, I actually kind of like the water level. I think the level design is more interesting, and the challenge is more fun, and the clunky controls actually work to the game's advantage in this instance. I like the music in the game a little bit, I guess, but I also don't really think it's much of a classic soundtrack. And I think that's it. There's not a whole lot good to say. It's a hard game, but not a fun one. So what makes the game hard? Well, simply put, it's the amount of enemies in every room, how small the rooms are, and how poorly the player controls. It's hard for all the wrong reasons, but it's hard nonetheless. Is the game worth playing? Honestly, despite my criticisms, I'd say yes. Because despite all of its flaws, it still kind of has a classic NES game quality to it. If you like TMNT and NES games, then I'd imagine you'd get something out of this. And if you like hard as fuck games like I do, this one may do more for you than it does for me. My own opinion aside, I can see why people might want to play it, so in that sense I think it's worth playing, but only if my complaints don't register for you. If the game sounds unappealing, it probably will be unappealing, but if you like a sloppy, hard-as-hell platformer with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles faces slapped all over it, then you'll definitely want to check out this game. I just have to get this out of the way right now. Fuck limited continues. Seriously, limited continues is bullshit. If there's ever been a thing that could qualify as artificial difficulty, it's limited continues. It doesn't actually make the game harder to play or to master, it just makes the game technically harder to beat, because it sends you back to the beginning. When I talk about how much I'm willing to allow a game with regards to unfair difficulty, this is my breaking point. Have unlimited continues. There's no reason ever why you shouldn't. So fuck it, I'm using the Contra code for this review. Anyways, with that out of the way, Contra is one of the best games of all time, and is easily in my top 5 of favorite NES games. A million things have been said about how great this game is, and about how hard this game is, but what I'm trying to do here is compare the different highly difficult games on the NES to each other, to really get a deeper understanding of what exactly makes these games the juggernauts of difficulty that we know them as. Like with the rest of the games, that all boils down to understanding the mechanics. The player character, who I'll just call Rambo because it's easier, is probably the absolute perfection of controls and game mechanics in a side-scroller. His running speed is static, no momentum, just hold a button and you're running at top speed instantly. For a game like this, it's absolutely necessary to have it function that way, because this is a game where the focus is going to be on everything around you rather than on your character, so the character needs to have simple controls for it to work. I don't usually talk about ducking, because ducking serves pretty much the same purpose in all games like this. You get a little lower and you can aim at lower things and also dodge things above you. Simple enough, but what makes Rambo's ducking ability special is that if you hold duck and then jump, you can jump down to a lower level of ground on screen. And that's important because it's a basic functional tool that almost no other games at the time had. The ability to drop down a level and back up again easily on lots of surfaces means that the world around you is never overtly the obstacle you have to deal with while playing. The jumping has a good degree of air control, which is good because this game emphasizes jumping possibly the most out of any of the games on this list, which is kind of funny because this is also one of the ones that's less often considered an actual platformer, but rather a side-scrolling shooter. In fact, I'd say this may be the game with the best air control of the major NES games that I've played, if not Mario 3. What's important is that at any point you can reverse direction in the air, and because your jumps aren't particularly wide in the first place, it never becomes a cheap way out, and it never feels broken or counterintuitive. I think the animation helps that too, because it curls up into a ball and rolls in the air, which, when you get to that level of cartoon logic, it makes more sense for the character to be able to reverse direction. After those things, the only mechanic left is shooting, but this is where Contra really separated itself from other games at the time. Not only can you attack straight ahead of you, but you can also shoot directly up, directly down if you're in the air, and you can also shoot in any diagonal direction. This is so important to why Contra works. It's such an intuitive design choice, but it's so rarely implemented at the time. For a side-scrolling shooter like this is as big of an innovation as when Mario introduced momentum into running. The thing is, there's very little to say about the shooting controls because they're so simple and effective, it's just a natural choice. It's so perfect that it's almost not even interesting. I can't really talk about what's there, but I can talk about what it would be like if it weren't there. Given the way Contra plays, imagine if you could only, shoot straight ahead. There are plenty of NES games where that's the case. Imagine level 3, which is a very vertical map, with those controls. You would have to get onto the same level as every enemy you come across before you can hit them. The level would be absurdly hard that way, so in order to compromise they'd need to take out a few of the enemies, and then the level would quit being exciting and it'd just be a repetitive mess of jumping up a platform and then shooting a couple baddies. Having the controls be so well done in the Contra we have now, you can hypothetically breeze past level 3, so the game compensates by having a lot of enemies showing up at once, meaning that now that you can fire at all angles, you're gonna have to. Of course, as with pretty much any NES game, there's also power-ups. And of course, that means we get to talk about the spread gun. Pretty much anyone who has played this game says that the spread gun is one of the best weapons in gaming history. I agree, it completely changes the game. It's not unfair, it just makes up for some of the unfairness that the rest of the game throws your way. It's almost like a vacuum. It just sweeps away enemies left and right, and goddamn is it useful as ever. Really, you want to be looking for the spread gun every chance you get. If you lose it, get it back. Again, there's very little to say about it. There's actually a bit more that can be said about the other power-ups. The specific ones I want to talk about are the fire gun and the laser gun. Both guns are generally considered bad, with the laser gun in particular being considered utter crap. But having played Contra recently, I'm a bit more inclined to defend them. They aren't great, and they certainly are worse than the spread gun, but they have their function. The thing about the spread gun is that it shoots in a few different directions at the same time, meaning there's some blank spots between the shots that enemies can slip through. The fire gun doesn't have as wide of a radius and can't hit as many things at once, so it's definitely much worse, but it does have its own unique function, because it spins around as it moves outward. That means that it basically covers the space of the blank spot that the spread gun has, so it's more likely to hit targets that are awkward to hit with any of the other weapons, and that's somewhat useful. The laser gun is considered complete shit, and I get it. But use it on levels 2 and 4 and you might see how effective it can be at times. It doesn't shoot the same way as other guns, but rather it shoots a laser that counts as like 5 or 6 hits all in a short space of time. That means rather than pressing B rapidly, it makes more sense with the laser gun to just hold it for a little bit. On levels 2 and 4, where you're trying to break the locks on the doors as quickly as you can, it will only take 2 shots with the laser gun in order to get a lock open, which means it's probably one of the quicker ways to beat those levels. Again, neither weapon are even remotely close to the pure awesomeitude of the spread gun, and if you have the spread gun, you should avoid getting these guns at all costs. But I do think they have some amount of unique function that makes them worth using if you happen to get them. The level design to the game is fairly basic, even as it gets to harder stages. The reason being that the shooting mechanics are kind of advanced for a game of this era, so the levels need to be a little simple to let the mechanics actually be useful. I mean, the diagonal fire ability would be utterly useless if every enemy came from directly ahead of you, and so the levels need to be designed with those features in mind. If you have a crazy amount of enemies to fight and crazy platforming all at the same time, the game would be too difficult. So as a result, the levels aren't terribly complicated, at least compared to a game like Ninja Gaiden. Levels 2 and 4, for example, are these strange front view levels, where you're stuck at the bottom of the screen trying to fight a ton of enemies while blowing open the locks on doors. These levels are extremely simple, but they're still a challenge because the simple design means that they can throw a ton of enemies at you, and level 4 specifically is just a non-stop barrage of enemies. The simple design of these levels emphasizes the shooting mechanic above all else. By contrast, Stage 7 clearly emphasizes the spatial aspects of the game more, with more platforming, more environmental hazards, and far less enemies showing up on screen. While I would say the game gets progressively harder, I don't think that's a result of a gradual increase in difficulty for the same basic challenges, but rather the game choosing to throw new challenges in your direction with each new level. The mechanics never change significantly, but the levels change with regards to what they emphasize. Level 3 is the most platforming-based level of the bunch, and it's probably my favorite level overall because of it. It's a rare vertical scrolling map in an 8-bit game, and it was really well done. Meanwhile, the final level is mostly about putting you up against set pieces, which I enjoy enough. I usually complain that when something interrupts the flow of gameplay, that it's a detriment to the game, but the set pieces that force you to stop for a bit don't interrupt the flow of gameplay if you ask me, because the flow isn't centered around movement or jumping so much as it is around the shooting. As long as you're shooting things, the game can slow down the movement aspects a bit, and it won't feel like the flow is being interrupted. Really though, it's the boss battles that I enjoy the most, because those are the most hectic parts, the parts where you have to balance running, jumping, and gunning at your best in order to pull through. I think if I had a favorite boss, it'd be the boss to level 6, because the challenge of having to jump over him when he's barely short enough to get over at all, while also avoiding his attacks, is a lot of fun. I think the boss also demonstrates a point about how a game can add in challenges without having to make major changes to the mechanics. Being forced to master the timing of jumps by throwing an enemy that's difficult to jump over is a very easy way to take the mechanics that are already there and create a unique challenge. If there's anything that an action game can suffer from, it's being redundant. I don't know how well I've come across in pointing this out, but Contra is very much not redundant. Every level puts you to some new test with the core mechanics, so the mechanics never tire out. You never sit around waiting for a melee attack because the game gives you plenty of different challenges with your projectile attack. You never sit around waiting for a level that takes place in a car, because the game already does well enough giving you dynamic levels just by running. Some games are defined by their gimmicks, while other games are defined by their primary gameplay, and I think Contra is one of the games that's most known for that core gameplay. Contra is just run and gun, in the most entertaining and dynamic sense of the term, without ever reducing itself to the monotony that a term like that can imply. So what makes Contra hard? Well, to be honest, it's really not all that hard. Contra does have the #1 cheapest move in 8-bit history, which is limited continues, and that definitely is enough to call it a true 8-bit bastard. But there's also the fact that you die in one hit, and so 3 hits can put you at the game over screen. That means that every last move counts, and considering the barrage of enemies and obstacles in your path, that's where the game becomes fucking difficult. But when you take away the cheap move of low life count, one-hit deaths, and limited continues, the game isn't very hard to me. It's still a challenge, but it wouldn't be an 8-bit bastard anymore. It's hard to say that any game can really be an 8-bit bastard without some sort of cheap move, and so in terms of difficulty, the low life count and limited continues is vital to the game, but in terms of entertainment value, I'd say not so much. So is it any good? Well, fuck yeah it is. It's one of the best games ever made. Despite the difficulty and cheap moves, the game never tires out, even when it sticks pretty rigidly to a run and gun philosophy. Apart from the controls being some of the best in NES history, the graphics are some of the best the console has to offer. The music is a classic, and one thing I never mentioned is that the game actually has co-op. I'm not a big fan of multiplayer games, but I really love co-op, because I love the idea of taking on a threat together rather than my friends being the threat. This is probably one of the most fun co-op games I've ever played, and this can definitely work well as a party night game too, with a couple controllers and a few friends who can swap places between levels of game over screens. That's a case where the cheap moves the game pulls actually benefit it, but when playing alone, it's still a massive amount of fun, and if you haven't played it yet, you definitely should. Really, this entire video was just an excuse for me to get a chance to rave about how much I fucking love Ninja Gaiden. Sincerely, this may be in my top 5 games of all time, and it is one of very few games that ever actually make my heart race. That's how tense this game is. For just a little bit of backstory, this was actually the first game I ever owned, along with Super Mario Bros. And another game which will be on this list later. 3 games plus the console and a controller for only $10 at a garage sale in the 90s. Now that is a deal. I guess I'd say that of all the 8-bit bastards, this one is probably the fastest. I mean, that is fair, this is the game where you're a ninja after all. I would honestly say the game is defined by 2 things, swift movement and difficulty. Of course, the two are at odds with one another from a mechanical standpoint, but in a more abstract sense, I think that the 2 elements work really well together. The reason being that, and this will sound silly, the game actually makes you feel like you're a ninja, kind of. A game that was less difficult wouldn't make you feel like a ninja because the lack of challenge would make it more boring. But the trial and error of an 8-bit bastard means that you have to learn some patience, some self-discipline, and you need to master timing and be prepared for things ahead of time. Just like, oh, I don't know, a ninja? All I'm really saying is that if you're going to make a game about being a ninja, the most effective way to make it feel like being a ninja is to make the player endure the difficult conditions of being one, so that they can learn the skills on their own that are useful for a ninja. If you want to play a game about cute dogs, play Nintendogs. If you want to play a game about being a fucking ninja, play fucking Ninja Gaiden. Really though, I think this might be the best NES game ever made. One major reason why is that the game actually has cutscenes, and I know that might sound really trivial, but hear me out. Cutscenes were not a very common thing back then, and while we take them for granted today, seeing an 8-bit cutscene is almost like staring into another dimension. It's almost kind of hypnotic. It's easy to get invested in the plot of a more advanced game, so when you go to a simple 8-bit game with cheap graphics, where you have to use your imagination to really get immersed, and then you get this, for the time, epic plot about ninjas and demons and CIA officers and scientists and all of this crazy stuff, the cutscenes help contextualize the action of the game in such a way that it makes the grandiose, anime-like plot feel grandiose. Traveling through these levels devoid of context is fun, but with context it actually feels like there's some weight and importance to what's going on. And for an 8-bit game, that is a massive step up compared to the average. That's not to say that the plot is mind-blowing or amazing or anything. It's a pretty simple plot and it's not terribly well written, though that could just be the result of the English translation, which is admittedly a little poor in a few places. Well, I guess it's pretty good that she's concerned about my safe. To be honest, the pulpy, cheesy plot actually works to the game's benefit though, because it adds to the charm. Games very often ride the line between mindless fun and something more serious. Just as people watching a movie can get invested in the plot, players can get invested in the gameplay. And I don't think I've ever been more invested in the gameplay to a game than Ninja Gaiden, because the game is so hard that I feel compelled to win, because letting the game beat me would be beyond painful. It's mindless fun, but you start to take it seriously when you get invested in winning. Just as playing the game itself rides that line between fun and serious, the plot does too, where the self-seriousness mixes with the cheesiness to make it so that when you play the levels and feel that sense of accomplishment for winning, you also feel the sense of accomplishment in the story happening around the gameplay. There's some weight to what's going on because of how difficult the game is, and the cheesiness is there to remind you that this is still supposed to be a fun experience, meaning I don't think I'd have the cutscenes any other way. The cutscenes are also visually striking, though it's kind of hard to tell considering the cutscenes appear to be in extra widescreen, like they're letterboxed down to 1/5 of the screen. Anyways, to talk about the gameplay, again I'll have to bring up my formula for functionality, which is the player's character versus the game surrounding the character. Ryu is definitely one of the more natural to control of the 8-bit bastards. Ryu's running mechanics are very simple. Just like Simon Belmont's walking, Ryu runs at a static speed, with no acceleration. He's either running or completely stopped, no sliding around. I think that's very typical of these kinds of games, which is part of why the 8-bit era was really the only era where these games could exist, because the momentum of Mario caught on more and more with platformers as time went on. Ryu's upper body doesn't move at all while running, which would hypothetically seem like it would make the running feel more awkward, but it actually helps, because Ryu is all about speed and swift movement. He's a ninja. Naturally, the character would move swiftly, and having his upper body stay still helps to showcase the swift movement and make him feel weightless. Having weight is good in a game like Castlevania, but in a game like Ninja Gaiden, you want to feel it flow rather than drop like a brick. One element of running that is vital in a game like this is that in long stretches of space, the screen scrolls with you, always staying directly in the middle. Rather than going too fast and the screen needing to catch up, it feels more like you're standing still and the world is moving around you. It's important because your center of focus should be the center of the screen, so that you can always be aware of all surroundings. It's a very obvious quality, but it's an important quality to why the game flows so well. It's also less painful to have your focus be in one spot, rather than have to keep repositioning your center of focus with each new obstacle that comes in. Ryu's jumping is pretty basic for a game like this. He just jumps. One of the main things that separates this game is that there is a degree of air control that's not present in some of the other games. You can't really reverse very well, but you can stall your movement so that if you jump too high, you can fix it by stalling your forwards movement, which is absolutely vital for a section like 5-2, where you have to make really difficult jumps. Remember how I said that Castlevania could have better jumping mechanics and suit the challenge around them? Well, Ninja Gaiden is proof of that, because for all of the improved air control, the challenge is overall even harder than Castlevania with regards to platforming. The most major feature of jumping that distinguishes Ninja Gaiden, and one of the more noteworthy things about the game overall, is that you have the ability to cling to walls. Most vertical surfaces can be clinged to, and this function serves a lot of purposes. In the first level, it serves as a nice platforming challenge that's easy enough to get you used to the mechanic. As the game progresses, it also serves as a way to dodge enemies and as a sort of safe zone, especially during boss battles. I think what's most important, however, is that the climbing mechanic allows for much more dynamic level design, but we'll get to that in a minute. Combat is again very basic, with only two kinds of attack, primary and secondary. The primary attack is your Japanese sword. It has a fairly short range, but it makes up for range with how fast you can hit. One interesting thing about the sword is that it stops you very briefly if you use it while on the ground, which means that hitting things while in the air is technically a faster way to play the game. Usually what this means is that when you're trying to make it through a crowded area, you'll usually have to jump, attack, and then attack one more time before landing to kill two enemies without losing any speed. Of course, this may sound like a speedrun thing, but in a sense it's kind of just a normal playing thing, because there's really no other way to play this game aside from fast as fuck. We'll get to that later though. The game is very similar to Castlevania in a lot of regards, and of course the secondary weapons are very similar. You slash open candles, bugs, and eagles to get ammo, and sometimes they'll drop secondary weapons, which you use up and B to attack with. Unlike Castlevania, however, the weapons have more variety and are more useful as a result. The important ones are the throwing star, the flame, and the jump and slash. There's two kinds of throwing star, but the one that I really like is the one that boomerangs back to you. What makes this one so incredible is that when you throw it and it comes back to you, you can jump over it, and if you continually dodge it, trying to make its way back to you, it can circle around you quite a few times, and the range it covers is pretty wide, meaning you basically have a big shield to protect yourself from incoming enemies. As far as I'm concerned, the best way to make a game is to make a game where the gameplay is uninterrupted by the mechanics. Throwing the star and letting it circle around you a few times is a way to quickly move through the map without having to worry about enemies, and that helps foster the flow of gameplay, which to me is the most important part of a game. Any combat mechanic that slows you down in some way is a weak mechanic. The jump and slash is by far the best power-up in the game, and one of the best power-ups in any game. If we're going to talk about how a power-up helps the flow of gameplay, I can hardly name one that does better than the jump and slash. What this does is it basically turns your jump into a form of attack, which I guess is a little similar to the screw attack from Metroid. This means that when faced with a ton of things that can potentially hurt you, jumping not only helps you get forward in the map, but also takes out absolutely every threat in your path during that jump, and this comes in handy a lot. In fact, speedrunners use this jump and slash to take out bosses in literally one hit, because the jump and slash I think has one hit per frame. It's pretty ridiculous. As for the flame, this is the noob's power-up, and it's definitely the second best power-up, though it's the easiest to use. It just shoots a big ol' flame up and forward. This one is particularly useful for the final bosses. I can usually beat all 3 bosses in one go, but for people who have difficulty with the final bosses, the flame power-up can be useful, especially for Jackweo, which I'll talk about more later, but it's definitely an overall very useful weapon. What really turns Ninja Gaiden from a fun platformer into an 8-bit bastard is a combination of the level design and the enemies. I'll talk about the enemies first. The first 2 or 3 acts of Ninja Gaiden are very unassuming. Not terribly hard, pretty basic NES game goodness, but around Act 4 you start to see how insanely hard the game can get. They just throw everything they can at you, and having so many enemies on screen at once is hard enough, but it gets so much deeper than that. One of the most frequent complaints about Ninja Gaiden is the enemy respawn. The enemies have spawn points that stay there no matter what. If you kill that enemy and then hit that spawn point again, the enemy will come back. This means if the edge of your screen is right on a spawn point, the enemy can respawn infinitely. Considering the speed of the enemies, that can sometimes create a lockdown where you can't move forward because you have to slash at the same enemy again and again. I can't call that a good quality to the game, but I never minded it, because it's all part of the challenge. But I have a feeling it was more of an oversight on behalf of the creators, rather than an intentional attempt at making the game more difficult. The enemy respawn, even when it doesn't create a deadlock, can be obnoxious because, like in all the best 8-bit bastards, you get knocked back when you get hit. This means that you can get knocked back behind a spawn point and then have to face the enemy again. And when you get to the later stages where there are several enemy spawn points in a short space, getting knocked back will respawn an enemy from behind, and then moving forward will respawn an enemy from up ahead. And you can get knocked in both directions, meaning that very quickly you can get juggled around like a rag doll and be brought to the game over screen in a matter of seconds. This all means that every move counts in the later levels of the game, especially 6-2. The enemies themselves are a nightmare, with the worst patterns and even worse placement. Early on, the game tricks you into thinking it's going to be easy, and you get some motorcycle machete guys and Apollo Creed, but then as the game progresses, you get introduced to some of the most obnoxious enemies ever, including the Reaper, the Green Ninja, Machine Gun Guy, and the Hawk. Oh, and the fucking jetpack ninjas. The Reaper isn't too bad. He's just a guy in a cloak, so I assume he's the Grim Reaper, but he throws what appears to be crosses for some reason. What gets annoying about him is that he stands really close to ledges, which means that in order to get to a surface to hit him, you need to be able to maneuver through his crosses and land in front of him without being knocked off by running into his body. These guys also respawn a lot because they're usually at the edge of the screen. The best way to take them out is with your secondary weapon, but if you don't have that, it's all about timing. The Green Ninja is usually not around pitfalls, so it's not the cheap pitfall deaths that make him a problem. It's his pattern. The pattern seems to be jumping at a set time while walking in whatever direction he just jumped in. So when he first appears on screen, he's facing towards you and running toward you. When he jumps, he either jumps into you or he jumps over you. If he gets past you, he'll keep running in that direction, but the jump is designed so that he jumps in your direction no matter which way he's facing, which means that his pattern is kind of hard to follow because it feels random, even though it's not. What makes the Green Ninja especially hard is that you can get a few enemies showing up at once, including multiple Green Ninjas, and the combination of enemies will create a pattern that can't really be worked around, and will end up taking a lot of damage unless you're really good. The Machine Gun Guy is pretty obnoxious. He shows up fairly early on, and doesn't seem too bad, but later in the game he becomes a real hassle. The reason why he's so difficult is that he shoots 3 bullets in a row and doesn't take long between shots. You can actually slash the bullets because you're that fucking awesome that you can destroy bullets with your sword, but 3 in a row is really difficult because it's faster than you can hit. So you have to get 2 bullets in one hit and then hit the 3rd bullet. Otherwise you're going to take damage, which doesn't sound too bad until you realize that the small downtime between firing means that after taking damage, you're going to take more damage, then more damage, until you finally go insane. I think most people think of the Hawk as the most obnoxious enemy in the game, and I can see why. I disagree, but I can definitely see it. The way the Hawk works is that it flies towards you no matter what direction you're in. It'll always face you. But it also has some momentum in that when it passes you, it slows down before it starts moving toward you again, which means that it can just continually wrap back and forth on the screen forever if you don't know how to kill it. Of course, killing it should be just as easy as slashing at it, but it gets a little more complicated. The main problem with the Hawk is that it's conveniently placed at really hard points, often around other enemies including other Hawks. It's not a difficult pattern to understand, but it's a difficult pattern to be conscious of while juggling 3 or 4 enemies on screen. Because the Hawk is much faster than other enemies, and because of its strange pattern and dickish placement, the Hawk is often what will push players into pitfalls. So yeah, it's a real motherfucker of an enemy. But there is a workaround. When it flies past you, run away from it until it's off screen, and then it'll just despawn off screen. This means that when faced with just a Hawk, it's as simple as a well-timed jump in order to get rid of it. It's a bit more difficult when facing other enemies at the same time, but it's a trick worth learning because it comes in handy a lot. If you ask me, the most insufferable enemy in the game is the Jetpack Ninja. This guy's a real fucker on 2 legs. Basically all he does is fly above you and shit out throwing stars before quickly flying away. The throwing stars are very small and very difficult to dodge, so you have to slash at least one of them before you can dodge any of the others. What makes the Jetpack Ninjas so fucking obnoxious is that they come in packs, and they shoot throwing stars in your direction. This means that they will just rain down projectiles that are almost unavoidable, and often difficult to even see because of how small they are. The jump and slash is the best workaround for these assholes, but when you don't have it, it really is just a matter of practice, of trial and error, to get used to their death from above pattern. The level design is fairly simple for most of the game, with the first level having no pitfalls, and each subsequent level becoming more and more liberal with the amount of pitfalls, until eventually you get to levels that are almost all pitfalls. Much like Castlevania, there's no vertical scrolling, meaning that levels are confined to a basic rectangular plane. But unlike Castlevania, the geometry is slanted for more perspective, and the wall climbing mechanic means that the level design can be much more dynamic. This means the jumps are a little less clear and a little more difficult on their own. And like I said, Ninja Gaiden has the air control that makes it easier to maneuver while jumping, and so the game shapes itself around challenging the player despite giving them more freedom, which they accomplish by adding jumps that are difficult and increasing the amount of pitfalls. Castlevania's level design was more like a flat surface followed by a staircase followed by a flat surface, meaning most of the time you were spending just walking. But Ninja Gaiden has much more platforming. There will be a constant up and down movement along the screen rather than just occasional changes to which half of the screen you're on. Whereas Castlevania was more of an action game with platforming elements, Ninja Gaiden is the perfect combination of action and platforming. It is both things at the same time, at all times. And that's what pushes it above the rest of the NES games for me. It's dedicated to its core mechanics and never abandons them for a cheap gimmick. The game doesn't change, it just progresses. It just gets more difficult. You just need to get better at platforming as you go, rather than master your platforming only to have an airship section with new controls that you have to master. Even the best games, like Mario, have swimming sections and auto-scroll sections that break up the gameplay too much. But Ninja Gaiden is that perfect mark of letting the level design and the mechanics alone speak for the game's qualities. The levels start to get difficult around Act 4, but don't hit the crazy 8-bit hell that the game is notorious for until around Act 5. The first real asshole move in the game is in 5-2. In almost every other instance of platforming with the walls, you have to move up the walls, but in 5-2 there's a brief moment where you need to move down the walls, which doesn't sound too bad except that there's a pitfall directly underneath you and a hawk is headed your way. But I've gotten it down well enough that I can beat it pretty much every time. First of all, get the health that's available right before it. Second, you're going to want to master the air control a bit. Notice how I jump up near the pit, and then I stall before I move towards the first wall. This is because I need to get really low on the wall, and if I don't stall, I'll end up getting up too high on the first wall. The hawk can be mostly ignored, But make sure that if the hawk starts getting close that you stay on the wall and just let it hit you. You can take some damage here. I can usually get this down in 2 jumps, but in the instance of recording this review, it took a little more than that. You want to do that same stalling move every time you jump, so that way you get really low on the left wall. One more jump and you should make it onto the platform and can move on. It's not too difficult when you understand the controls, but learning the part means you'll probably die quite a few times. I'm not going to give tips on everything in the game, but I do also want to talk about 6-2, otherwise known as Hell. 6-2 starts off easy enough, but it quickly turns into a nightmare. The first big obstacle are the jetpack ninjas in the first section. The easiest way to beat it is to get the jump and slash and just use that to kill all the throwing stars and just get past the section as quickly as possible. The next really hard part is in section 3, and this is the notorious part that many people consider the hardest part of the game, though I do disagree. The first difficult part is a guy comes running from behind, a hawk comes flying from underneath, and a bat comes flying in from the right. There's no handy trick here, just dodge them and try to move past their spawn points and kill them so that way the screen is cleared up. The next part is a reaper, a guy running at you, and a hawk, all over one of the longer jumps in the game, right above the biggest pitfall in possibly any 8-bit game ever. The trick here is really easy. Just inch towards the reaper and he'll eventually walk off screen and despawn, because he's a big wimp. The hawk is next, and usually what I do is I just run close enough for it to spawn, and then I jump the gap while slashing at the hawk. And after you land, the foot soldier has enough of a delay where you can be ready for him when he shows up. Seems hard, and it takes some practice, but it's not the hardest thing in the game. The boss battles are noteworthy as well. The first few bosses are pretty simple, just some basic pattern recognition, and they all have easy workarounds. When you get to boss 5, the game throws a massive curveball at you, because before the bosses required patience and pattern recognition, but if you waste any time on boss 5, you will die. There's no workaround, just get up to him and start hitting him. The quicker you can damage him, the quicker you can beat the boss. Once you know that trick, he's another easy boss. The final boss is actually 3 bosses, and this is where the game goes from being an 8-bit bastard to one of the most notoriously difficult games in existence. Anyone who knows Ninja Gaiden from front to back knows about it. If you die on any of these bosses, you go back. With previous bosses, you go back to the start of the previous level, but with these bosses, you go back to the start of the fucking act. Meaning you have to beat 6-1, 6-2, and 6-3 all over again. Easily the hardest maps in the game, just to have another attempt at the 3 bosses. I'd say that's probably the 3rd biggest fuck you moment in 8-bit history. Luckily, when you beat one boss, it replenishes your health for the next boss, and it also doesn't require you to beat that boss again. Unfortunately, they don't replenish your health if you've already attempted the boss before, which means if you go back and come back with 1 health, you have to fight the boss with 1 health, and the boss's health is back to full. I recommend that when you get to 6-3, if you have a life to spare and you have low health, on the last section of 6-3 you should waste your life so you come back with full health. I also recommend stocking up on ammo during 6-3 and getting the firepower up towards the end of the level, so that way you can use that on the boss. The first of the 3 bosses is really easy. You just get really high on the walls when he gets too close, wait for an opportunity to jump over him, and then slash at the red orb in the center of the level. Pretty easy. I haven't died on that boss ever, I don't think. But then we get to Jacquio. Now this is the hardest thing in the entire game. Holy shit. I really hate this boss, but I also kind of love it. In the cutscenes, Jacquio looks literally like a pile of shit with a face, and in the game he really does look like a flying dried up turd biscuit. But he's probably the hardest boss that I've ever beaten in a game, and I'm gonna tell you how to beat him without any cheap workarounds because that's how I do it. So when I recorded footage, I had unfortunately died on Jacquio earlier, so I stocked up on flames, and it's a really good idea to do that. But regardless, my technique doesn't require any power-ups. Jacquio's pattern is really easy to understand, it's just difficult to maneuver. He just moves back and forth over the top of the screen and shoots 2 fireballs at you at a consistent but slow rate. What makes it really hard is both hitting him with your sword and dodging his projectiles. The way the projectiles work is that they fly towards you and they kinda home in on you. Depending on where you and Jacquio are in relation to each other, the fireballs will home in at different convergence points. If he's directly above you or almost directly above you when he fires, the fireballs will meet and cross past each other very high on the screen. And if this happens, you need to walk between the fireballs and let them pass. If you try to dodge them by walking outside of the trajectory of the fireballs, they'll probably hit you. If he's not directly above you, the fireballs will usually cross each other towards the bottom of the screen, meaning that you need to be out of the trajectory rather than standing between them. That's an easier thing to dodge, and so you want to time where you are so that the fireballs will cross lower on the screen and be easier to avoid. Which means whenever he fires, you want to be standing a good ways past where he is, but not as far away as possible, just far enough away from him so that he won't be firing from directly above you. You can manipulate the fireballs to always be easy to dodge this way. From that point, the hard part is hitting him with your sword. The way to handle this is to jump on the middle platform when he's to the right of it, and then jump and hit him with the edge of your sword so that way you have enough time to fall back down and not bump into him. It's also best to jump onto the platform immediately after dodging one of his attacks so that way you can hit him before he fires again. It's difficult to master, but it should be pretty easy to understand. There's also a glitch where you can slash more times in the air by pressing down then B repeatedly, and you can get 2 or 3 shots on Jackweo pretty easily, and I recommend exploiting this as much as you can during this boss and the last boss. The last boss is only slightly easier than Jackweo, and you'll have to exploit the air sword glitch a lot. You want to chop off his head first, then chop off his tail, then go for his stomach. The hard part is avoiding his projectiles that just kind of flop out all over the place. I recommend focusing on those much more than going for the kill, and only attempt to hit him between bursts of projectiles. Once you get that, you should have the game beaten easily enough. So, what exactly makes this game hard? Well, everything. It's got that perfect balance of timing, precision, speed, reflexes, and absurd level design, enemy placement, and patterns. It also has some of the hardest bosses of the NES era, and it has the 3rd cheapest move a hard 8-bit game has ever pulled, sending you back to play the 3 hardest levels in order to even get another chance at fighting the final bosses. What makes it worth the time? Well, it's just a tremendously enjoyable game. Perfection doesn't always need to be easy, and Ninja Gaiden might even be a perfect game if you ask me, because everything that makes it frustrating is part of what makes it enjoyable, and aside from that, it just controls really well and feels satisfying. It has that same feeling that a game like Shadow of the Colossus has, where the game doesn't feel so much fun as it does rewarding. It's one of the best examples of system mastery in a game, where the enjoyment comes from getting better at the game as you go. There are plenty of games that I'm really good at, and Ninja Gaiden is one of the most fun to play after having mastered the controls and memorized the levels. People talk a lot about the skill ceiling in games, and they talk about how good you are or can be at a game, but I think what people don't take the time to think about is how much getting good can affect the experience. And while I do think early stages of Ninja Gaiden are fun even if you aren't very good, I think it's important to think about how much fun a game can be through actually improving at it, and some games just aren't worth the investment of getting better at. But I think Ninja Gaiden is a game that's worth practicing and going through that trial and error. I'd also say that the story is probably the only good story in an 8-bit action title, and the graphics are impressive for the time, and again, the soundtrack is one of the best in gaming history. It definitely has all of the feeling of a big adventure compacted into a little 8-bit package, and the difficulty helps immerse you in the adventure if you ask me. It's definitely worth the time, probably the most of any of these games. This game makes me want to rip my fucking skin off. This game is seriously just way too hard. I don't know how the hell the AVGN can beat this game, and I can't even get past level 3. But then again, I can beat Ninja Gaiden and he can't, so who knows. Different strokes for different folks, I guess. Which is appropriate because this game is the equivalent of a stroke. Really though, it's not all that bad of a game. It's just sincerely the most sadistic game I think I've ever played. And I used to play I Wanna Be the Guy somewhat regularly. It almost has an intangible quality of sadism though, because it's hard to really describe what makes it so fucking hard, but I'm gonna try anyways. First of all, the obvious. You die in 2 hits, and there is no health. This means you have to make it all the way to a checkpoint without getting hit twice. That alone is some next level difficult shit, but you can still make an easy enough game around that. Combine that though with unresponsive controls and enemies with really difficult patterns to avoid or even memorize, and you eventually get a living nightmare of a game. The bottom line is, Arthur controls like ass. It feels like holding ass in your hands, and not in a good way. He can only attack in left or right directions, while enemies come from all directions. His jump isn't very high or far, and there's absolutely no air control. The game seems to demand some pixel-perfect precision while not allowing you to actually pull it off. I think the biggest problem though is that some enemies are almost completely unavoidable with how they move, and so you need to kill them before they even come close, which most of the weapons won't allow. The game is so fucking hard that some people genuinely believe that without the knife, the game is impossible. It's technically possible without the knife, but I can't for the life of me get a hold of the knife whenever I play, so I can't even make it past level 3, where the boss is completely unavoidable if you don't kill him before he gets close. Another major problem is that the enemies take too many hits to kill. Like the ogres in level 2. They take so many hits that if you don't keep your distance and start throwing immediately, you're beyond fucked. And that's level 2. Out of 6. Not to mention the infamous you have to beat the game twice move that the series is notorious for. I'd say that's probably the second worst cheap 8-bit move apart from limited continues. Honestly though, I don't know if this game would actually be better for having unlimited continues. I think the game might make more sense with limited continues because unlimited means that you can get in a deadlock where you can't get the knife, but you need the knife in order to beat the part. Not to mention, unlimited continues means that you end up enduring the pounding that the game gives you for an indefinite amount of time. And the game doesn't even look that bad from an outside perspective. It looks just like a normal NES platformer. The graphics are cutesy compared to something like Castlevania, but make no mistake, because if you actually play the game, and you're about as good as I am at it, it'll be torturous. The game is basically, have fun, but also, fuck you! And to me, it's just bad game design. I don't think this game is good and coincidentally hard. I think it's so hard that it stops being as good. I can still give it a lot of credit for being creative and really pushing the boundaries of difficulty, but it's hard to even call this a fun game unless you want your games to be utterly sadistic. Again, I can't really call it bad, but it is technically somewhat of a mess. The level design is okay, but not particularly inspired, and the game is so hard that it doesn't even feel rewarding to play. It's just a test to see how much of a beating you can take, and apparently I can only take 3 levels of abuse before throwing in the towel. Maybe I'm being too harsh, maybe I just suck, and if so, then please leave a comment, letting me know how much of a noob I am and how you beat the game 3 times in a row while blindfolded using just your elbows while eating an entire pizza. But I'm gonna move on to the next game. Okay, so next up is... Nope. Wait, hang on a second. Hang on. So next one is... Oh, nope. Fuck, damn it. Hang on. I got this. Hang on, wait. Next up is... Come on. Ah, fuck. Damn it. Hang on, just wait one more second. I got this. Next up is... Yes! Okay, so... Next up is Battletoads. Battletoads is a true classic in most senses of the word, or rather, it almost is. Battletoads is one of the stranger games I've ever played, because there's so many directions that the game could have gone, and the one they chose is so bizarre. Battletoads is made by Rareware, which we all know for making like more than half of everyone's favorite games ever. They did Donkey Kong Country, Donkey Kong 64, Banjo-Kazooie, GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, and my personal favorite, Conker's Bad Fur Day. I could do a whole video on Rare games if I wanted, but right now, I'm just gonna focus on Battletoads. So what makes Battletoads such an oddity of a game? Well, because it has all of the setup of a true classic game. Fun story, this is the first game I ever owned. I got it at the same time that I got Ninja Gaiden and Super Mario Bros. When I played it as a kid, there was definitely a classic feeling to the game. But all I remember growing up was playing up to level 3. I don't remember ever playing any further than that. Upon playing it as a teenager, I found out precisely why I never played past. Because the game was the hardest motherfucker of all hard games out there. But those first 2.5 levels have this classic nostalgia factor for me. It feels like the whole game should have just been like that. But then the game quickly goes off the rails and becomes something altogether unlike any other game I've played before. You see, Conker's Bad Fur Day is quite a shock of a game for people who aren't acquainted, because the game's content is very much at odds with the aesthetic. That's intentional. Conker's Bad Fur Day is meant to be an adult game that looks like a kid's game. The shock value is right there from the start. Meanwhile, Battletoads sets itself up as the best beat-em-up game of all time. Then you get to the Turbo Tunnel, and everything changes dramatically. But those first two levels are such a tease. It genuinely feels like it's building up to a different, more cohesive experience. It feels like a huge bait and switch, and I think that Battletoads had, at least for a number of years, gone off radar as one of the baddest of the bad in game history, specifically because people were only acquainted with those first two levels as kids. Now that the internet has spread the word, we all know Battletoads is one of the top contenders for hardest game in history. But my question is, how many people grew up in my situation had a completely different image in their head of what the full Battletoads experience was? Before you heard about the later levels, could you have ever imagined that Battletoads would turn into what it is? The real question, though, is if I would have preferred an alternate version of Battletoads that was more coherent and less difficult. The answer is a massive no! Battletoads, despite being hard as medicine balls, is actually one of my all-time favorite games, and I haven't even managed to beat it yet. It's really hard to review this game like any other game, because with other games you can discuss core mechanics and then from there talk about the levels. But in this game there aren't really a set of core mechanics, because each level is kind of its own thing altogether. This is truly the ideal version of a genre-bending game. It crosses a few different genres and does so seamlessly. The different gameplay styles are all tied together by a basic moveset and the graphics. Anyways, level 1 is a straight beat-em-up game. I think one thing that everyone who plays Battletoads for the first time will notice, in a subconscious way, is that this is one of the most kinesthetically pleasing games ever. What I mean is, the game feels really great to hold in your hands. That's mostly because of the way that combat works. When you punch, you get a few hits on someone, and then for the final KO, there's a small delay, and then the Toad's fist gets really huge and knocks the enemy out of sight. I think that kind of kill is up there with Doom or the gravity gun for most satisfying kills. It's that small delay that really makes you feel like you're putting extra strength into the final punch, and the giant fist certainly helps. The first level is easy enough, and the boss is one of the weirder things in a game, because it's a second-person perspective. You fight the boss from the boss's point of view. And really, the boss just has the worst aim. I mean, he's not even anywhere near hitting you. But this boss shows very early on that Rare had a lot of creativity with how they approached game design. And even though this game is very different from their later games, you can still feel small sparks of the same company that made Contra and Donkey Kong Country. The second level is somehow even more satisfying than the first. It's an auto-scrolling level, which I usually hate, but in this game it actually kind of works, mostly because the Toad auto-scrolls with the screen. And there is an element of speed in that the quicker you kill enemies, the more seamless the level goes. The best part of this level is the Wrecking Ball move that you can do. It's honestly better than the Giant Fist just because you really feel the slam that he gives to any enemies, and watching them just bounce around inside the hole is a lot of fun. There's really not much to talk about with level 2 either, though. Level 3 is where the game turns into an 8-bit bastard fast. The first half is easy enough. You just fight some boxing rats. And again, it's satisfying as hell to turn your foot into a giant boot as you kick them out of the screen. There's also little Space Invader creatures who try to take your health literally from out of your health bar. I really love this little detail because it breaks the fourth wall as a means of attack. And that's something I wish we could see more in games. Having your health bar itself be vulnerable to attack is such a neat idea to me. Anyways, I know what you're waiting for me to talk about. The Turbo Tunnel. Arguably the hardest moment in gaming history that a lot of people have actually played. Personally, I never thought it was all that hard. I mean, sure, it did take me a long time to figure out how to beat it, but I honestly feel like most of the difficulty comes from not having the pattern memorized. Once you have the pattern memorized, there's only one difficult part, and it's the ending. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely a very hard moment. It's just that, considering it's early on, you get a lot of chances to practice it and really get it down, and really learn the progression. The thing that makes it hard is that, first of all, it goes on for a really long time, and there's long stretches before a checkpoint is reached. Second of all, there's some really tricky moments that almost seem like they're too clever to be a good idea in a part like this. There's a wall that's placed directly in the middle of the path at one point, and because none of the walls before it were like that, your brain doesn't catch up in time to notice that it's even in the middle, and so you get hit by it repeatedly, not knowing why you died. And then there's a ramp on the bottom at one point, and since you're not expecting that to happen, you don't really process that it did happen, and you just think it's glitched. The fake out moments are clever, but in such a rapid, difficult section, you don't notice that it faked you out at all, and that's why it becomes hard. The third thing about it that's hard is that the screen moves really fast, and it can be really disorienting. I honestly felt like I was gonna have a seizure while playing because of how fast everything is moving on screen. I mean, you're flying through Satan's asshole at 90 miles per hour, and you have things in the foreground moving at a faster speed than things in the background. And the mixture of textures and how elaborate the textures are, and how fast they move past is dizzying. The fourth thing that makes this section difficult is that the controls are very floaty. That's fitting because you're on a hover bike, but what happens when you get to a section like the one where you're forced to jump repeatedly? The floaty controls don't really allow for precise jumping mechanics, and you have to be really good with how you time it in order to beat the part. Even when you have the pattern memorized, the floaty controls can still be a big killer. The fifth thing, and easily the biggest thing, is that you die in one hit. Usually, a minigame moment like this would maybe give you infinite tries, or maybe getting hit would take 1 health off, or maybe getting hit 3 times would mean death. But here, you don't get to fuck up even once without major consequences. The details definitely make it a very difficult moment, but the big picture is just pattern memorization and reflex. When you get the pattern and reflexes down, it's not nearly as intimidating as it seems. If you ask me, level 4 is probably my favorite level in the game. Well, at least of the ones I've played. If level 1 was a straight beat-em-up game, level 4 is kind of like a straight platformer. It's also a nice level, and we all love those, right? To be honest, the biggest thing holding it back is that it's an ice level. Not because I fundamentally hate ice levels, but because the slippery controls go beyond being annoying here and almost being broken. You have to get really fucking good at this level before the slipperiness stops being a major issue. What I really like about this level, though, is how creative the player has to be in order to survive. Every section of the level is designed in such a way where the player not only needs to be quick to react, but also relatively pixel precise. Rather than a big open playfield with which to traverse, the level's fairly claustrophobic, especially for an ice level, and the amount of instant death obstacles thrown in liberally means that the player has to be really careful about when they time their jumps and just how long they hold the jumps for. In a lesser game, this could easily stand to be the final level, but here it's only an early level in the game. Of course, this level is extra hard by virtue of the fact that this is the first time where platforming is a major feature in a level, and so the player has to quickly acquaint themselves with how to platform in this game, while also dealing with the goddamn ice level. I would say that if most players have a difficulty curve, this game has a difficulty spike, because once you get to level 3, it's nothing but pushing the player to the brink, but not just in the same way over and over again, but in new ways too. Level 5 has some resemblance to the Turbo Tunnel, but it's definitely much easier. Rather than flying on a speeder bike, you ride on a surfboard, because I guess surfboards are cool or something. The level's still a challenge, but the surf sections move slower, and the auto hop makes dodging things a little easier. Not to mention, if you hug the bottom and occasionally move out of the way, most of the obstacles will be easy to avoid. There's also a giant rat for a boss, and he's pretty hard, but if you know the secret, which is to corner him and just pound him in the ass repeatedly, then he's not too much of a hassle. And then level 6. To be fair, I haven't even beaten level 6, so I can't really talk about the rest of the game. But level 6 is the Snake Tunnel level. This level is back to straight platforming, but this time there's no enemies, it's entirely platforming. What you do is you ride on giant snakes and try not to fall off, while avoiding spikes that kill you instantly. What makes this level so hard is not only the fact that it's halfway into the game and thus you don't have much of a chance to train for it, because you've already spent a number of lives on the previous few levels, but also because it's one of those levels where the challenge gradually escalates to absurdity. First, you just have to know how to ride the snakes. Then, you have to know how to ride the snakes while avoiding spikes. Then, you have to know how to ride the snakes, but there's no floor, so you absolutely cannot fall off. Then it keeps getting harder, and I don't even know what happens past the 4th screen, because I've never managed to make it past the 4th screen. The biggest challenge here, other than the wonky controls, is simply the fact that the spikes kill you in one hit. You can't afford to mess up even once with this level, and that's one of the major features that makes Battletoads arguably the hardest game ever made. It's one of the least forgiving games, but the constant introduction of new gameplay elements means that on top of not getting much of a chance at the level, you also don't get much of a chance to learn the level, so you never really get better, except by playing through the whole game numerous times. Of course, that brings me to my number one most hated thing about some of these games. Limited continues. For fuck's sake, never have limited continues in a game. It doesn't make a game more enjoyable at all. It just makes the stress of beating an already difficult game just that much harder. So what makes it hard? Well, if you couldn't tell, the game gives you very few opportunities to learn how to play it before throwing something new at you. The game has limited continues, so you don't get infinite chances to learn a new part before being thrusted into previous levels, which are already some of the hardest levels in gaming history. The game has a massive difficulty spike that prevents new players from even seeing half of the game. The controls are a little difficult to manage, and you die far too easily. But is it any good? As I already said, yes. It's one of the most unique experiences I've ever played, because of the high number of gimmicks the game dives into. Even though it's hard, the core of what the game is, beating the shit out of things with giant fists as an anthropomorphic frog, is satisfying enough that it makes you want to keep playing. The game that has that heart-racing quality that Ninja Gaiden has, and the game looks pretty good and has pretty good music too. I also didn't mention the co-op, which I've heard is actually harder than single player, which is probably true, but even so, co-op is co-op, and that's a good feature to have, especially in a game from the NES era. Okay, so if there is one thing I learned through making this video, it's that the devil really is in the details here. While the big picture of a game can look easy enough or fun enough, it's the specifics, like how the character controls and how the creators construct the levels, that can really separate a fun game from a bastard of a game. These games are a fascinating time capsule of the late 80s for gaming, seeing the remnants of arcade games, including the difficulty, emphasis on score points, and life count, as it started to mix with how we now come to understand console games, including storylines and a lengthier experience. Not all of them are equal, but they're all equally interesting to study. If I had to pick a favorite, I'd definitely say Ninja Gaiden, with Battletoads at a close second. If I had to pick a hardest, I'd say Battletoads followed by Ghosts and Goblins. If I had to pick a most polished, it'd be Contra followed by Castlevania. And if I had to pick a worst, it'd be Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I recommend all these games to people who find them interesting, and I hope this video was as fun for you to watch as it was for me to make. Let me know if you made it this far in the video and what you thought about the video, as well as any of these games. Until next time, thanks for watching.